Joining us on the line now via Zoom is the Nelson Mandela Foundation CEO, Sello Hartang. Mr. Hartang, thank you very much indeed for your time.
Thank you very much, Blaine. Good morning.
Regarding this conflict, you say the foundation is troubled by the complexity of the challenge to the world order. How is the foundation processing these complexities?
You know, I think the trouble about today is looking at any conflict. It's oversimplifying it. It's either black or white, and the simpler the better, and there's no space for nuance. And I think what the foundation's board decided was we need to add a bit of nuance to the current conflict, that it has some origins without being seen to be justifying it. Because all of us agree that a wrong is being committed at the moment. But that we need to then be not be ahistorical people who don't then remember how such a conflict has happened before. When you look at the Cuban conflict, where the Russians wanted to put nuclear weapons in Cuba and Grenada, and how the U.S. government reacted back then. They were short of attacking Cuba, but they then blockaded it. And I think if we are to look at what's happening today, it's unfortunate that now the conflict is underway, and we have asked our government that it be seen to use its influence as a member of BRICS to call on Russia to stop the guns so that we can then begin the process of rebuilding and negotiations. There's never a time, it's never too late to negotiate, as we have proven over and over as South Africa.
Yeah, you have urged the South African government to show leadership at this critical moment and press for the ceasefire so that rigorous negotiations on the future can be mapped out. Or what do you think about the current stance that government is taking with regards to this conflict?
You know, one of the saddest moments about this conflict is that it takes us back, Blaine, to 2003. Remember when Madiba angrily reacted to the attack of Iraq by the US and the UK government, and of course joined by other allies. At the time, those Western forces were saying to everybody, you are either with us or you are against us. And they bullied everybody to then be with them. And those who disagreed vehemently, like the South African government did back then, were then isolated and treated like they did something wrong. At the moment, again, the West is bullying everybody to then say, you need to show that you are with us in condemning Russia. And we're saying condemnation, we need to go beyond condemnation. We know that a wrong has been committed, but now what next? We need to then be showing leadership, because Madiba back then said there's a failure of leadership. And at a critical moment like this, we are about to see failure of leadership again. And we're saying it's time for us to then urge the South African government to also speak to their partners in the form of the Russian government to say, let's negotiate. But another thing that we shouldn't forget, Blaine, is what's been happening to Black lives. How at a time of conflict, you have people who still have the time to hate, to show their hatred of Black people. Black people who are being pushed out of trains, who are being pushed out of public transport like buses, and then when they make it to the border, in the Polish border, they are not allowed in, as if they are not, they are naturally built not to be killed by those guns. White lives, again, are proven to be privileged and are shown to be the ones who are then mattering more. And as the foundation, we're saying, let's try to take this moment and reflect on how you can't be asking for solidarity from the rest of the world, including Africa, but you treat African children the way you've been treating them. It can't be right. And I loathe racism. I loathe people who are racist. And I think if we are to declare that kind of loathing of racism, we will begin to see a world that says, at a critical moment like this, let's suspend our hatred for Black people. At least suspend it. if you can't just at least get rid of it completely. And let's not be forgetful. There are people who have been critical to say, why would you mention racism when people's lives are being lost? Surely black lives also matter to be rescued like white lives.
Let's just take that a bit further and talk about the narrative. Have Ukrainians firmly, in your opinion, the Foundation's opinion, seized the strategic narrative? Have they managed to convince the world that they are participating in an unprovoked conflict, or is the jury still out on that more than a week in?
You know, one of the sad things about this conflict is how the Foundation describes it, Blaine, as a sense of belonging. Russia believes that Ukraine belongs to them, that it should be a neutral zone. That doesn't then have an impact on its security. And I think at a time like this, we need to be saying, maybe, is there a point where a country is justified to attack another? And the answer to that is no. But while we do so, is there a point where your security, your interest as a nation becomes so threatened that you then do what you need to do? And I think there's no justification for war at all. What we need to then be saying to the US, for example, the UK, the French, and others who are participating in actively calling for sanctions and other stuff, what do we need to do to show leadership at a point like this? When the US used to do it with Cuba, and Bernie Sanders recently pointed out that it can't be right for the US government to be cozying up to the Ukrainian government at a time like this, that it was going to cause war. And I think maybe it's a time for the Ukrainians to also be reflective, but also for the Russians to say, here we've gone too far by crossing the border with guns.
From top to bottom, from president to ordinary citizen, have Ukrainians been effective in mobilizing their own people, but also mobilizing very quickly a massive international coalition to support them?
You know, the sad reality is that when you see people being given guns so irresponsibly, that at least that's the reports that we're seeing, that guns are now being distributed to citizens. It makes citizens also fair game. And that's wrong. It can't be right at all. And I think we need to, at a point like this, be a little sober and say it can't be right that you distribute more arms to promote more conflict. It can only benefit those who are producing arms. And in a time like this, citizens should then be saying, maybe it's time that those who need to flee, they flee, but how do we ensure that we stop the conflict ourselves too? I know that I'm asking too much of Ukrainians, but I'm asking of Russians the same, that citizens should pressure their government to say, maybe you've gone too far. And it's at a time like this that you see that active citizenship then needs to kick in. Should they be taking up arms? I don't think that's the right way to do it, Blaine, unfortunately. Because for as long as you have an AK-47 in your hand, you are fair game for the Russians to then also do damage to you. And that can't be right too. And I'm asking, we are pleading as the Nelson Mandela Foundation that it's time for peace. Let there be ceasefire for people to then begin to reflect on what needs to be done to ensure that Ukrainians are safe. And we are really broken by the loss of life, infrastructure that's being lost, the danger of the nuclear plants being blown up, endangering even more lives, innocent lives, but also those who are not even part of the conflict, like African countries that are now feeling the pinch through the petrol price that's going to be going up, the food that's going to be going up. So the impact is wider than just the countries that are involved in this conflict.
Yeah, you listed just two examples of why we should care, watching from afar. People say, why should we care about what's happening in Ukraine? You listed two: fuel prices, food prices. One of the biggest exporters of grain is Ukraine. Let's look at options and state of play. President Volodymyr Zelensky is staying and fighting. But what happens if he's captured or even killed? Would it be easier for Russia to then convince the world and say, look, there is no legitimate government in Ukraine, so, as some analysts suggest, they will install their own? This in comparison to the other option, if Zelensky leaves Ukraine now and sets up a government in exile, what would be the best for the people of Ukraine, do you think?
I think the best thing, the first thing is for there to be ceasefire. And I don't think we should even be contemplating the death of a president. And I'm hoping that we don't get that far. And that's why in the letter that our chairman, Professor Njabulo Ndebele, sent to our president, he not only urged the president to continue to pressure government of Russia that we should continue with the negotiations, but he also then offered the services of some of our trustees who have dealt with conflicts before. The Nelson Mandela Foundation, that there are experts who can help with this kind of conflict resolution. But I think contemplating the death of the president is too far, and I'm hoping that we don't get that far. In fact, I do not even want to think about it. I shudder to think of that kind of outcome.
Political endgame, what do you think it is?
The political endgame should be that the same kind of pressure that the U.S. applied previously, that Cuba should be non-aligned in the sense that there shouldn't be stationed stuff that could then endanger the U.S. Just as in Mexico, you couldn't do the same. In Canada, you couldn't do the same. I think there should be some common understanding that even with a sovereign state, there should be some limitations. And I'm hoping that the U.S. will plead with the government of Ukraine that maybe we should not do what we should be able to follow the example of what happened in Cuba back then. And it was then made a neutral zone in that sense. And I'm hoping that the end game will also be about defining new rules of the game or of engagement, that it can't be right, that some rules apply to some and others not. And I think until such time that we can confidently say that there is no divide between those who can be bullied by the U.S. and its allies, similarly that you can be bullied by the Russians. And I think we should then find a way where the world has same rules that apply to all. No invasion should happen and be allowed. And the UN at the time should also be strengthening its hand in that.
Selo Hatang, we appreciate the perspective as well as context. Be well.
Thank you very much, Blaine.
All right.